This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome back, everyone. We're diving deep today into a pretty heavy topic.
Yeah, definitely.
The internment of Japanese Canadians during World War II.
Right.
And I think a lot of people know, like, the basic story,
Mm-hmm.
but we're going to go way beyond that. We're going to look at, like, the lasting impact.
The ripple effects.
Yeah, for decades
Mm-hmm.
after the war ended.
Long after.
And to help us kind of unpack all of this, we're going to be drawing from a really insightful podcast episode.
It's a good one.
Yeah, it really dives deep into, like I said, those long-term consequences.
Yeah, it goes beyond sort of just the wartime experience.
Right.
And gets into, what it meant for people's lives.
Yeah.
For years and years afterward.
Well, and I think it's interesting how we often think of, internment is just like this wartime thing.
Right, like it's contained
Yeah.
to that period.
But for, 22,000 Japanese Canadians.
Wow.
That's a huge number of people.
That's a lot of people.
Their suffering didn't, magically disappear when the war ended in 45.
No, it certainly didn't. It's almost hard to wrap your head around,
It's staggering.
yeah, like whole communities uprooted.
Lives turned upside down.
Yeah, and this wasn't temporary. you
Yeah.
know? This had a lasting impact.
So then, okay, if the war's over in 45, what kept this suffering going?
That's the key question, right? And to answer it, we have to look beyond the camps themselves.
Right?
Like one of the biggest things was the economic devastation.
Okay, so even though they were released, they couldn't just, go back to normal?
Exactly. It wasn't just, okay, you're free now.
Mm-hmm.
There were so many obstacles. Think about this. In 1943, the Canadian government passes this thing called the Custodian of Enemy Property Act.
What?
Yeah. Basically, they could take control of Japanese Canadians' assets.
So, their stuff?
Everything. Homes, businesses, even personal belongings, all sold off.
No way.
And often, way below market
Yeah.
value.
Wow, it's hard to imagine, having your home.
Yeah.
The place where you've built a life.
The place you belong.
Just, taken and sold.
Without your consent, yeah.
That feeling of loss, that powerlessness.
And the financial impact was huge.
Mm-hmm.
Years later, there was an attempt at compensation,
Okay.
in 1950.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a pittance compared to what people lost.
So how much are we talking?
They paid out $1.3 million.
That seems like a lot.
It sounds like a lot, but it was divided between over 1,400 people.
Okay, so not that much per person then.
No, not nearly enough to rebuild a life.
Yeah.
No, not even close.
So even though the war is over, they're facing this huge uphill battle
Absolutely.
just to get back on their feet financially.
Yeah, and it wasn't just about money. I mean, there was this social alienation
Okay.
and the trauma
Yeah.
that lingered long after the war.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, these were loyal Canadian citizens,
Right.
many of them born in Canada, suddenly treated like enemies.
By their own country.
Yeah, that feeling of betrayal.
Wow.
It's hard to overcome.
How do you even rebuild trust after something like that?
It's a good question. And then, it gets even worse. Up until 1947, Canada was deporting Japanese Canadians
Wait, deported?
back to Japan.
But they were Canadian. How?
4,000 people lost their citizenship.
What?
Another 6,000 deported
So you're telling me people who were born in Canada, they were sent to a country?
that they'd never even been to in many cases.
That's crazy. That's just absurd.
It was. And the podcast actually quotes people from the time,
Oh, wow.
calling it a crime against humanity.
I mean, it's just hard to believe that something like that could happen here in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
But even after the deportations ended, things didn't just go back to normal, did they?
No, not at all. In 1949, Japanese Canadians were finally allowed to live anywhere in Canada.
Oh, okay, so that's cool.
You'd think it would be this moment of relief, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it was complicated.
Complicated how?
A lot of people face real challenges trying to reintegrate.
So even with the legal restrictions gone, there were still all these invisible barriers.
Exactly.
So even with the legal restrictions gone, there were still all these invisible barriers.
Yeah, I mean, you think about it, most people didn't actually go back to British Columbia,
Oh, really?
where they had lived before,
Before the internment?
Yeah.
Why not? I mean, I guess. You'd think they'd want to go home.
You would, but think about what they went through.
Yeah.
Their communities were just shattered. Trust was broken. There was this feeling, I think, of just unease.
Yeah, totally. Like, I mean, I can't imagine trying to rebuild my life in a place that had, like, so recently rejected me.
Right. And on top of all that, they faced racism.
Still.
Like discrimination.
I mean, it's just awful to think about. Like, they were denied jobs.
Housing, everything.
Just because of their heritage.
Simply because they were Japanese Canadian.
It's crazy how deeply rooted prejudice can be.
It's a reminder that freedom on paper isn't always the same as freedom in reality.
That's so true. And the psychological impact, right? I mean, that had to be immense.
It was. The trauma of internment, it's stayed with people.
Yeah.
For their whole lives.
Yeah.
And often led to mental health issues,
Yeah.
That's something that's not talked about enough, I think.
It's like, how could it not? I mean, you go through something like that.
Exactly. The scars run deep.
So, okay, it's clear that the impact of internment lasted for decades.
Yeah.
But did anything ever change? Like, did Japanese Canadians ever get any recognition for the injustices they faced?
They did, but it took a long time.
Okay.
And a lot of fighting.
Fighting from?
The children of internees, actually.
Oh, wow.
It was this new generation that rose up,
Yeah.
They wanted justice for their parents.
That's incredible. It really shows how the trauma of internment, it wasn't like contained to just one generation.
Right. It was passed down.
Yeah.
Became part of their family history.
So this movement, when did it really gain momentum?
It started in the 60s and 70s, and then this incredible thing happened.
Okay.
In 1988, the Civil Liberties Act was passed.
And that was a big deal because...
It was the first time the Canadian government formally apologized
Oh, wow.
for the internment of Japanese Canadians.
Wow. I bet that meant a lot to the community.
It did. It was huge.
What did the apology actually say, though?
Well, Prime Minister Mulroney at the time, he called internment a grave injustice.
Mm-hmm.
And he acknowledged that it was a violation of civil liberties and constitutional rights.
It's pretty powerful to hear the government admit that they were wrong.
Yeah. It was
Yeah.
a big step toward acknowledging what had happened.
So was that all, like, was it just an apology, or was there more to the Civil Liberties Act?
No, there was more. They also offered financial compensation
Okay.
to surviving internees.
How much?
Each person got $21,000.
It's something.
It is, but it was mainly symbolic.
Yeah.
Like, it was an acknowledgement of the harm,
Mm.
but money can't really erase the pain and suffering, can it?
No, of course not. And I mean, think about all the economic losses they face.
Right, like losing their homes, their businesses.
Their life savings, their livelihoods.
Exactly. How can you put a price tag on that?
It's a reminder that, financial compensation is important, I guess, but it can only do so much.
It's a start, but it can't fix everything.
Yeah. So what was the reaction to the Civil Liberties Act? Like, was everyone happy with it?
It was mixed, actually. Some people felt it was, it was long overdue.
Yeah.
Like finally some recognition.
Hmm.
But others felt that it wasn't enough.
What do you mean?
Like they wanted a more comprehensive approach
Phew.
to addressing the lasting impact of internment.
So even with this historic apology and compensation, there were still a lot of complexities?
Yeah. And that kind of leads into, this other layer of the story. The podcast also looks at how historians have interpreted Japanese Canadian internment over the years.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just about knowing what happened, but like understanding how it's been understood.
Exactly. Like historians have debated, why did this happen? And what does it all mean?
So there isn't like one single answer or interpretation.
No, not at all. There are lots of different perspectives.
Okay, so what are some of those perspectives? Like, how have historians tried to make sense of this event?
Well, one perspective is what some historians call the national security school.
Okay.
And they emphasize the wartime context.
Okay, so they're basically saying that internment was justified because of the war with Japan?
Well, they say it was driven by fears of espionage, sabotage, that kind of thing.
So, like, they saw Japanese Canadians as a threat.
Yeah, even if that threat wasn't real, they
Yeah.
focus on the military and political calculations being made at the time.
Okay, so that's one perspective. But I imagine there are other historians who disagree with that view.
Oh, absolutely. There's another group, the racial prejudice school.
Okay, and they argue.
They say that focusing only on national security, it ignores a really important part of the story,
Which is?
racism.
Right?
They say that anti-Asian racism in Canada, especially in BC, played a huge role.
So they're saying that prejudice was a driving factor behind internment.
Exactly. And they point to the fact that other groups like German Canadians, Italian Canadians, they weren't treated the same way.
Right. They weren't subjected to mass internment.
It shows how deeply ingrained prejudice can create a climate where something like this can happen.
And it also kind of goes back to that feeling of betrayal that we were talking about earlier.
Right. Like Japanese Canadians weren't just seen as a potential threat.
They were targeted for who they were.
Exactly. Their race, their heritage, it played a part.
So we have the National Security School and the Racial Prejudice School. Any other perspectives we should know about?
Yeah, there's another interesting one. It's called the Economic Interest School, and they focus on, well, economics.
So, like, money. What does money have to do with internment?
Well, they argue that some people actually profited from internment.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, remember how we talked about the forced sale of assets?
Like their homes and businesses?
Yeah, they were often sold for way less than they were worth.
Right.
And some people, they swooped in and bought up all this property.
A net bargain.
Yeah, and basically enriched themselves.
Wow, so it wasn't just fear or prejudice.
It was also greed.
Opportunism.
Yeah, and this adds, another layer to understanding why internment happened.
It sounds like all these different perspectives, they kind of complement each other, don't they?
I think so. They each highlight a different piece of the puzzle.
And when you put them all together, you get a more complete picture.
Yeah. And there's actually one more perspective I want to bring up.
Okay, what's that?
It's called the Civil Libertarian School.
And they're concerned with?
Rights, like legal rights, constitutional rights. They see internment as this massive failure of the Canadian government to uphold the rights of its citizens.
So they're basically saying that the government broke the law.
They argue that the government was so caught up in wartime anxieties and racial prejudice that they trampled on basic civil liberties.
So Japanese Canadians were denied due process.
Their property was confiscated without just compensation. They were detained arbitrarily.
Wow, it's a pretty damning indictment of the government's actions.
It is, and it reminds us how easily rights can be eroded, when fear and prejudice take hold.
It's a cautionary tale.
It is, and that's why it's so important to understand history.
To learn from the mistakes of the past.
Exactly, so we don't repeat them.
It sounds like all of these different historical interpretations, they offer us a framework for thinking about not just what happened, but why it happened.
Yeah, and they challenge us to think about how we can protect civil liberties today.
To prevent this kind of injustice from happening again.
Absolutely.
This has been a really insightful conversation.
It's a really important topic.
We've covered so much ground.
We have.
From the personal experiences of those who were interned
Yeah.
to the broader historical context
Really.
and all these debates about the legacy of internment.
It's complex.
It is. It's a reminder that history isn't just something that happened a long time ago.
It's still relevant today.
Yeah, it shapes who we are and the choices we make.
Absolutely.
It's just amazing to me how this one event, the internment of Japanese Canadians,
Right.
it has so many layers to it.
It really does.
We've gone from those personal stories, those hardships, to the fight for redress.
Yeah.
And now we're seeing how historians are still grappling with it.
Trying to make sense of it.
Yeah, the meaning, the significance. It really shows how history is so much more than just dates and facts,
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's about perspective. It's about interpretation.
It's about how we make meaning of the past.
Yeah. And how that meaning changes over time.
Exactly.
As new evidence comes to light.
As our understanding evolves. So we've explored all these different perspectives, these different lenses for viewing this event.
Yeah.
But what does it all mean for us, today?
Right.
In the 21st century, why should we care about something that happened so long ago?
That's the question, isn't it? Why does history matter? And I think for me, the answer is that history isn't just about the past.
Okay.
It's about the present and the future, too.
Okay. So you're saying that we can actually learn something from studying something like Japanese Canadian internment?
Oh, for sure. I mean, think about the themes we've been discussing. Fear.
Prejudice.
The abuse of power. The erosion of civil liberties.
Those are all things we're still dealing with today.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They might look different. The context might be different.
But the underlying dynamics are the same.
Yeah. It's like history's giving us this warning.
Right.
Showing us what can happen.
Yeah.
When fear and prejudice are allowed to, take over.
When we don't stand up for what's right.
Exactly. So by understanding how those forces worked in the past, we could be more vigilant.
Okay, so how do we do that? How do we actually put these lessons into practice?
Well, for one thing, we need to be able to recognize the warning signs.
Okay, so like what would those be?
Discriminatory language, policies that target specific groups, attempts to silence dissent.
It's about being aware, paying attention.
And then we need to challenge those things. Speak out against injustice.
And not just speak out, but like actually do something.
Exactly. Support organizations that are fighting for human rights.
Get involved in your community.
Vote for leaders who uphold those values.
So you're saying that history can be a tool for change?
I think it has to be.
It's not enough to just know what happened.
We have to learn from it and do better.
This has been a really powerful conversation.
It's been a privilege to be a part of it.
Yeah. We've covered so much ground, from those personal stories to those broader historical debates.
It's a complex story.
It is, but it's a story that needs to be told, and it's a story that I think everyone can learn from.
I agree.
Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful, and we encourage you to keep learning about this important chapter in Canadian history. Until next time.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.